everyone, and welcome to my lunar eclipse forecast for Bitcoin, which is going to look at not just the upcoming full moon that we've got on the 19th of November, which is also a lunar eclipse in Taurus, but the next 3 months or so. And really, I suppose what I want to kind of look at is the next lunar month in particular. So as we move from November into December, I'm going to do a separate forecast on the upcoming solar eclipse that's happening on the 4th of December, which is a new moon, because that for me always begins a new 6-month cycle. So I'm going to kind of cover Bitcoin, particularly over this period of the waning moon cycle, so from the 19th of November through to the 4th of December in detail. And then I'm also going to look at some projections for the end of December. A lot of people are sort of projecting, they're kind of speculating about whether we're going to have a top, whether the Bitcoin bull run is going to reach its top in December, or whether it's going to be in sort of early to kind of the first or second quarter of 2022. So I'm going to look at that, and then yes, a couple of other things to point out in terms of themes, because one of the huge themes of this upcoming eclipse focuses obviously on the bull, because this eclipse is happening in the sign of the bull, Taurus. It's where the moon is exalted. So it's interesting that we have this idea in trading of things going to the moon, when we kind of have a bull run and things move to their peak. But some really, really interesting stuff to look at. So let's dive in and see what we can, look forward to over the next couple of weeks. So first things first, what are lunar eclipses? So essentially, a lunar eclipse is a turbocharged full moon. So generally speaking, for me, this is about kind of endings, culminations, flowerings, but also climaxes. So it could be, as I say, that during a lunar eclipse that we are either closing something out. So in some ways, we might be closing out themes or situations or kind of projects that began around about the time of the solar eclipse that we had back in June. So the solar eclipse, I think it was in Gemini. But it can also be when things kind of come into their full flowering, because of course this is when the moon is fully illuminated, is at a full moon. It's fully illuminated by the sun, and in this case the reason that the moon turns kind of a blood color, which we'll see is very interesting in relation to the themes for this full moon, particularly the idea of the divine feast, that essentially it's the shadow of the earth that is being cast onto the moon by the sun, which is on the other side of the earth. So that the earth, the sun and the moon are lining up directly in a kind of 180-degree line, and this is what often causes this kind of shadow falling onto the moon. But essentially, as I say, it is good for closing off 6-month cycles. So I think really kind of closing out the dip that we had starting in May, when we had that kind of mid-cycle dip, that kind of crash, that huge crash. But I think also in some way letting go of what no longer serves us within the space, kind of really shedding as well anything that's no longer useful. And here I'm thinking about the fact that we've just had a taproot update a couple of days just before this, and I think we're kind of moving into a new milieu, which I think is sort of reflected in the chart itself. So we'll look at that a little bit more too. But in general, you may want to, if you're interested in timings and that kind of thing, there may be links between this particular lunar phase and what occurred in either August 2008, because that's when the last time we had a lunar eclipse in this particular sign, or November 2003. So there might be some links to those two time periods. You might want to kind of go back and have a look. But generally speaking, I think the interesting thing about this particular lunar eclipse is that it's in the Scorpio-Taurus axis. The last set of eclipses was in the Sagittarius-Gemini axis, and that's because the lunar nodes, as we call them, move backwards in the chart. So they move in an anti-clockwise direction as opposed to a clockwise direction, and that's why we cycle backwards through the zodiac. So it's the opposite direction to the direction in which the sun moves on a kind of daily basis, and so on. So this is setting up a new eclipse cycle for the next 2 years or so, which will take us into October 2023, and that may be significant, particularly when we look at the Gann cycles again. So we're going to have a look at those towards the end of this particular forecast. But I also just want to emphasize the fact that a full to waning crescent moon is a time of harvesting, of flowering, of reaping rewards, of sharing, disseminating wealth, and again we'll see this with the divine feast and this idea of blood sacrifice, but also of gifts and knowledge. And in this forecast, as always, I am sharing some of the knowledge that is being shared by other people who are generous in spirit, such as Jordan Lindsay of Conquering the Market. So credit where credit is due. I just kind of feel that what I do is take some of their predictions and kind of add an astrological kind of overview. It's always confirmed for me by the astrology, if you like, and vice versa. So yes, anyway, let's kind of move on and look at some of the themes in more detail for this particular lunar eclipse. So as I was saying, one of the themes around a lunar eclipse is kind of conclusions or kind of coming full circle. And one of the huge themes that I looked at in my more kind of astrological forecast for this eclipse, which you can catch on YouTube, is this idea of coming full circle and the zodiac and the Ouroboros. So in astrology, for example, the sun takes a full year to kind of go around the zodiac. And so the zodiac, particularly in medieval astrology, was very strongly linked to the agricultural year and the agricultural calendar. And of course that in and of itself lends itself to this idea of kind of the harvest and feasting and sort of sowing seeds and all those kind of things. And then of course we have this idea of the Ouroboros, which is the circle of life. It's the dragon eating its tail, and this ties in very strongly with eclipses because they happen at the lunar nodes, which were also known as the head and tail of the dragon, particularly in Arabic astrology. So there's a strong link here to the south and the north node, which are the kind of the axis points of fate in astrology, particularly in sort of evolutionary astrology. These are hypothetical points where the paths, the orbits of the sun and the moon cross, and they tend to be, it's usually where eclipses occur. So they occur, if you have a total eclipse, it happens usually right on the node. If it's a partial eclipse, it happens quite close to the node. And in this case, we've got a partial eclipse because the sun and the moon are in the signs of Scorpio and Taurus, but the nodes are still in the previous sign, so they are still in Gemini and Sagittarius. So we've got a kind of this slightly liminal thing sort of happening. But I think what I really want to point you to is this idea of Ouroboros feasting, of things coming full circle, and the self-enclosed feeding of the soul as the kind of the circling of the sun, the zodiac in the heavens, so cycles of birth, death and renewal, which kind of operate on so many levels. But of course, when we are talking about Bitcoin, we're talking about the 4-year cycle, we're talking about the sort of the bull market, and it's kind of the sort of the bull and the bear cycle. So you could almost see the bull and the bear markets or kind of time periods as being very similar to the head and the tail of the dragon. So really, really interesting theme of the circle, of the zodiac, of the Ouroboros, and so on, which we'll see reflected, as we go through the forecast. So just some overall themes that I want to kind of point you to. First of all, because it's in the signs of earth and water, sort of two yin or earth-water signs, we are talking about a strong emphasis on materiality, sensuality, abundance, sharing wealth and opportunity. These are really the sort of what Scorpio and Taurus represent as a kind of polar axis. Taurus is very grounded. It's very rooted in the senses and in material kind of wealth, abundance and fecundity. It's the fecundity of the earth. It's where Venus is at home, if you like, as kind of this sort of earth goddess, this kind of goddess of fertility and plenty. And of course Scorpio is all about kind of death, but also rebirth. So again, reiterating this idea of the Ouroboros, kind of birth and death as a cycle. And it's interesting that I've kind of mentioned this before, that we are at a point where Uranus is going through the sign of Taurus, and of course Uranus is very prominent in the Bitcoin chart, where it is helping to revolutionize or to reform the areas of banking and finance in particular, but also things like farming and agriculture. So where we kind of get our bounty from on all kind of levels. So I think that's important to sort of bear in mind. And the other important thing to remember about this particular cycle is that the luminaries will also be T-squared to Jupiter. So we had that back in May and June as well. So there's kind of we could kind of say that we're almost kind of coming full circle in terms of that theme. So that's just something to kind of bear in mind as we move into December, because of course Jupiter is always really prominent in December, because Sagittarius season is the sign ruled by Jupiter. So, and Jupiter is extremely prominent in the in the Bitcoin chart and in kind of big moves, if you like, in relation to price action and that kind of thing. And then the other thing is that on the same day we will have a Venus-Uranus trine. So this is very auspicious energy. It's about kind of unexpected windfalls, gains, that kind of thing. So there is an element of the unexpected as we move through this week of quite volatile energy, when we have quite a lot of negative aspects to Uranus from Mars in particular, but then we move very swiftly into positive aspects with Venus. And as we'll see, Venus is currently in Capricorn, it's in an earth sign, and I think that we're going to see things shift quite remarkably from, you know, kind of seemingly unexpected losses to, you know, to kind of gains in quite a short space of time. So just kind of bear that in mind. You know, Uranus is the planet of the unexpected, of it's very unpredictable, it's quite volatile. So, you know, expect the unexpected, you know, when it comes to this period. Now, something that I'm going to return to is this idea of sacrificing the bull. Now, obviously, we are talking about coming up to the peak of the bull run in relation to Bitcoin. And I thought it really interesting, particularly if we think about mystery religions like the Mithraic tradition, which was very popular amongst Roman soldiers, kind of around about the 1st and 2nd centuries, you know, kind of CE. And what's so fascinating about it is that it's all about Mithras, who's kind of like a warrior figure. He's a winged warrior figure, and he slays the bull. And many people have pointed to this as being very, very symbolic, you know, in terms of fertility and sacrifice, that it's all about the cycle of birth and death that we see so strongly in the Scorpio-Taurus axis, and how death begets life. So this idea of the Ouroboros. And so, you know, for particularly, you know, during the sort of the early period when a lot of these ideas were being formed, including astrology and other mystery religions, there was a timeless link between animal sacrifice, sometimes also human sacrifice, particularly in the Celtic traditions, as we are now discovering from sort of archaeological digs and bog bodies and things, particularly in Ireland and in northern England. So there's this link between animal sacrifice and agrarian fertility, and we see this in sort of figures like Osiris, Dionysus, Bacchus to an extent, and then also how this gets reflected in the Christian tradition as well, where Christ sacrifices himself on a cross, but he is the vine, you know, so he is the vine that begets, you know, the grapes and so on. So there is this strong idea of the male figure, which I looked at in my last forecast. I think it was the Aries full moon forecast, when I looked at this idea of Mars as Eros Thanes, Mars as the life bringer, as the kind of the greening, the green man, and how we've, particularly in the West, we've forgotten this. You know, we've kind of moved into this idea of only seeing the masculine in terms of the sort of the slayer, or the kind of the bringer of death, or the soldier, and how we need to reclaim this so that we move out of kind of toxic masculinity back into a much more generous and kind of holistic picture of the masculine energy. So in relation to the bull, when the bull was dying, it began to produce miracles in Mithraism. So you can see in this image, for example, that someone's holding up a sheaf of wheat, and we've got this, the bull has been sort of, here it's being stabbed by Mithras, and we can see blood kind of running down, and there are two animals that are sort of leaping towards this this blood, which is essentially the sort of the stuff of life. It's what feeds the body, it's what takes nutrients around the body, and in a similar way we can see that these animals want to kind of feed on this blood. And of course one of them is a snake, which, you know, ties strongly into this idea of this sort of the chthonic form of the Ouroboros, so the natural cycles of nature are here on Earth. And yes, so from its dripping blood grew grapes. And as I say, this is a strong link between this idea of the masculine sacrifice, like Christ, for example, being crucified and then stabbed on the cross, and this idea of grapes. And of course, wheat and grapes are the base ingredients from which we create things like bread and wine. And so this is the sort of the stuff of life. You know, this is really the kind of the bare basics of what sort of makes up life. And here we have this very strong link to Taurus and abundance and that kind of thing. So some people have pointed to this as being the sort of the death of barbarism and the conquering of kind of animal instincts, you know, in favor of the fruits of civilization. You could say that. I mean, there is this idea of the knife as being almost a kind of a technology, something that we have created. It's not natural. natural, and that we use this to sort of kill nature, to sort of cut down the sheaves of wheat, or to collect or harvest the grapes in order to make wine, and that's kind of part of the process, certainly. But I think in relation to Bitcoin, what is so interesting is this idea of the bull as being the source of this feast on which we can all kind of dine, and which can be a sort of a source of abundance and fertility. So we'll get onto that a little bit further on. But let's look at the chart in a little bit more detail now. So we've got the Bitcoin chart here, and around it are the transits. So this is where the planets will actually be at the time of the eclipses on the outside of this chart, and then the inside is the Bitcoin chart itself. And there are a couple of things to note. So as I said, the first thing is that the Sun and the Moon will be in a T-square to Jupiter. So you can see Jupiter here in Aquarius, sitting at about 24 degrees, and you can see it's very close to the Bitcoin. Neptune, which rules the 8th and the 9th houses. So these are the houses of things like shared wealth. So again, a strong link to this idea of, sort of sharing wealth with others, but also of funds that are kind of not necessarily derivatives, but are kind of, they are often ETFs or funds that kind of involve collective forms of wealth, or where there is a sort of like a third party type of situation. So where you're not necessarily buying Bitcoin itself, you might be investing in the fund, or in shares. And also the 9th house, which is the house of kind of foreign entities, beliefs, philosophy, and that kind of thing. And so I think that what we're going to see quite strongly is that our ideas around Bitcoin and what it can do are shifting. And I think that that's happened over the last 3 months since we had that lunar eclipse in May. It sparked a lot of debate, first of all, around energy usage in relation to Bitcoin, and that led to things like the Mining Council. It led to a lot of miners moving. There were a lot of miners that were on the move from China to North America. There were a lot of developments in the space around mining, and I think it's interesting because Mars is kind of down here in Scorpio in the 4th house, which is the house of mining, incidentally. It's the house of roots, of what's kind of deep in the ground, that kind of thing. But it rules the midheaven. So this is actually where the future direction of travel of Bitcoin. So I think we're kind of reorienting. We're starting to see the importance of, not just Taproot as well, which is another thing. And of course we had that recent upgrade, which I think is also going to affect future direction of travel with Bitcoin, and also allow for sort of layer 2 and layer 3 applications to be more efficient, where we can have smart contracts, so no longer being confined to things like Ethereum. That smart contracts are becoming a lot more doable now on Bitcoin. Before Bitcoin was seen as a little bit clunky, and but also this idea of mining as being an important source of wealth for the Bitcoin community, and a lot of investment going into the mining sort of sphere, which I think is fascinating. We had there's been quite a lot of developments in this area. People talking about developing new forms of kind of mining gear. There's also been talk of there's been new sort of applications developed which will allow people to not just to mine, but also to create NFTs, so non-fungible tokens, at the same time, and kind of rare non-fungible tokens, as well as make the process fun. They talk about kind of combining gaming into the mix as well. So there's a lot happening in the space, and there has been a lot happening in the last 3 months, and I think that maybe now we're going to start to see how these are going to bear fruit kind of moving forward as we go into this new cycle, which will begin on the 4th of December. So the other important aspect here is a couple of very positive aspects to Pluto. So both the Sun and the Moon will be making positive aspects to Pluto. And we can see Pluto here at around about 24 degrees of Capricorn. So it's sitting in the 6th house, which is the mechanisms of Bitcoin, how Bitcoin works on a day-to-day basis. And the sort of the everyday functioning, the smooth functioning of Bitcoin. So, Pluto in this chart rules the 5th house, which is the house of speculation, but also of legacies. And, it also rules for me, when I'm talking about speculation, I'm talking about not just the sort of the day-to-day trading of Bitcoin, but also things like derivatives and the derivatives kind of market, as well as things like legacies and how, because the fifth house is also the house of children, so it's kind of our offspring, or what we give birth to, what we leave behind. And I think that a lot of people are thinking about how they can contribute to the Bitcoin space in a way that leaves a legacy, not just for themselves and for their particular company, but also for the entire Bitcoin community. So there's a lot of focus on that as we see things like that new fund that got started, which I looked at last time, the 1031 fund, which aims to sort of fund the work of Bitcoin developers, for example, and get plowed directly back into the community. So there's real emphasis on kind of fertility and growth, if you like. And also sex, because Pluto is the ruler of Scorpio, and, of course, that's where the sun is going to be at this full moon eclipse, along with Mercury and Mars. So a lot here about fertility, feeding into those ideas that I was talking about earlier, about sex and about the kind of the life force energy, combining sort of passion with love, and then sort of generating from that sort of a new offspring being born, kind of thing. So I kind of think that, given that we've got these positive aspects to the sun and the moon, you can see that the moon here in the sign of Taurus in the 11th house, which is the house of community and groups, but also hopes and aspirations, that I think there's this kind of idea of empowerment, of kind of healing and regeneration, and also I think of finding ways to work with the powers that be, not necessarily working against. Uranus is the kind of the rebel energy that we see so strongly in Bitcoin, but I think there's also something to be said, and I think Michael Saylor said this so well in his recent interview with Pomp on the Best Business Show, that in order to facilitate a kind of a transition into a new era of finance, which could have Bitcoin at its center, kind of decentralized finance, that it may be better to work with things like tax authorities and accounting systems and that kind of thing. In other words, the old system, in order to facilitate a smoother transition, so that it doesn't have to be quite so violent, or people don't have to necessarily pick sides, or that kind of thing. Pluto's in the sign of Capricorn, which is the status quo, it is the sort of the establishment. So there is a huge shift happening, and it's been happening since particularly those Saturn-Pluto aspects which defined 2020, starting with that Saturn-Pluto conjunction that we had around the lunar eclipse in Cancer at the beginning of sort of in January, but more or less the same time that COVID kind of broke out or became like public knowledge. And there's a strong link with Pluto of breaking things down, it's the great destroyer, but this allows for recycling to happen. So there's a breaking down of the natural order, but it's a slow process, and that there's a need to sort of to try to find ways to incorporate the old into the new, or to find replacements for the old that are going to allow for a smooth transition from one kind of order into another, not necessarily like a violent transition, that it would be preferable ultimately for everybody if there was a smooth transition, in terms of the workings of things, the financial system, from one system to another. So just something to think about there, that Pluto as the regenerator here, and this breaking down of the old, and the sort of the recycler, if you like, which again also I think we can see in terms of, if we want to talk about legacies and people developing more efficient ways of mining, that there's also this idea of recycling and reinvention of energy here. And then the other thing to sort of bear in mind is the movements of Venus, because Venus is in Capricorn currently, and it's coming up to the Bitcoin sun. Now Venus tends to be one of the main kind of wealth indicators, and it's very often Venus transits or transits to the Bitcoin Venus that leads to kind of tops or kind of all-time highs. But the interesting thing about Venus is that Uranus is applying to a trine to Venus. So here is Uranus in Venus-ruled Taurus in the kind of in the 10th house. So this is kind of like almost the culmination point or the kind of noon point in the chart. So investors kind of reaching euphoria, if you like. But what's so interesting is that Venus, as it approaches the Sun, you know, and we get into December, Venus is going to retrograde. So it's almost like we start to move up to a peak, and then we sort of reverse a little bit, or we kind of go sideways for a while. So it's just worth bearing that in mind, that Venus, you know, is going to retrograde from around about the 19th of December, so around about the solstice, and that this could affect when we actually reach a peak in terms of the Bitcoin cycle, because of course the Sun rules you know, wealth. It rules what's golden or what shines. It rules the ascendant of the chart. So Bitcoin herself, as I like to say, the queen bee. Before I kind of get on to the movements of Jupiter and Saturn, which of course set off 20-year cycles in the financial markets, so both are important. I thought let's just kind of recap on the Gann cycle, which will kind of tell us, which kind of gives us an overall picture of where we are in relation to kind of markets and market movements. So if we consider that based on the Gann cycle, 2021 is speculation and sort of top of the market, and that 2022 is considered to be the time to sell. So this is the kind of the height of the bubble. The 2023 is considered to be the time when we move into a period of decline. So this is the bear market. And then finally, you know, so a major crash at the beginning of 4 years of declining prices and recession, which then takes us into a property crash, you know, and means that real estate can really be picked up cheap by the time we get to 2026, 2027. And of course, what I think is so interesting is that, you know, the Fed has said that they're going to do a taper. So this will affect particularly the S&P 500, the NASDAQ, so American markets. And they will start to do this in 2021. And, you know, and this could well bring to a close the bubble, leading to a major crash in possibly around 2023 based on this cycle, followed by sort of a property lull, you know, in 2026, 2027. So that's the kind of the Gann cycle. That's what, in terms of timing, you know, what the Gann cycle is kind of telling us. But what we need to bear in mind with the Gann cycle is that very often there's an overlap. You know, the Gann cycle runs for about, you can see here, it runs for about 20 years. So clearly in relation to the Saturn, the same period of time as a Jupiter-Saturn cycle, which we had a refresh of in 2020, and you know, at the solstice we had that grand conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius at the same time as the winter solstice, and coming on off the back of that eclipse, as well as the Bitcoin Jupiter return. So a lot of things happening all at once during that period, and of course that's when Bitcoin really kind of took off. And that is what I discuss on my Astro Insights blog, which you can go and read for yourself. It's called Bitcoin Comes of Age. So I'll put the link in the description box if you haven't seen that article already. So this 20-year cycle kind of running, but you know, it's interesting because running kind of concurrently to that is the eclipse cycle, the Saros cycle, which is approximately 18.5 years. So it's not exactly the same as the 20-year cycle of Jupiter and Saturn, but it's very similar. But it kind of gives us an overlap. So it means that we have what they call a metonic reset. So the Saros cycle resets itself just before we come to the end of the Gann cycle or the Jupiter-Saturn cycle. So very often that can intimate when we kind of reaching a tipping point or a turning point, you know, in relation to things, you know, almost like the solstices, that they are the time of maximum light, at which point we may not realize it, but we've kind of reached that culmination point, much like a full moon, when things are at their brightest. But this is also the time when things turn and begin to decline. So it's when the sun starts to lower in the sky, when we start to move towards winter. It's the start of the kind of the 3 months leading towards winter. So I think that eclipses in this instance can give us a kind of an indication of, you know, when maybe, you know, it might be time to think about exiting or planning your exit strategy, because things are kind of now on the turn. Now, Jupiter in relation to Bitcoin is particularly interesting. So just as a kind of a recap, you know, if we want to look at market crashes and market cycles, the last time we had a sort of a big crash was in around about 2008. So we had a mid-cycle crash, what I call a mid-cycle crash in 2020. But the last real big kind of crash was actually in 2008. And this was preceded by what I call the Saturn-Neptune opposition. So this was kind of fantasy money. There was tons of hidden debt in the system. And it led to a lot of gambling and market manipulation, which I think is indicated in astrology by Pluto in Sagittarius, which it kind of occupied for a 12-year period right up until November 2008, which is more or less when we kind of had the crash. So as Pluto moved from Sagittarius into the more conservative Capricorn is when, you know, the gambling and the market manipulation finally sort of undid the system. So this leads to the 2008 credit crunch, which is when Satoshi Nakamoto writes the Bitcoin paper, the Bitcoin white paper in sort of Halloween of 2008. So that's October, you know, 31st of October 2008. And this is followed by the mining of the first block in January 2009. Now, what's so fascinating about this timing is that he mines the first block on the 3rd of January 2009, just days before Jupiter ingresses into Aquarius, which is where Jupiter currently we find Jupiter now. So there's this fascinating link between events, astrological events back, you know, in 2009 and what's kind of happening now. So you know, the Bitcoin chart already sort of has this kind of signature built into it. So, you know, if you are familiar with the Bitcoin chart, you know that it's got Leo rising and Aquarius setting, and that this kind of ascendant descendant axis reflects the themes of kind of sovereignty and sort of freedom on one hand, but also the kind of the diametric opposition between kind of fiat currency as represented by the king, the regent, who can be a tyrant, and who rules often who kind of gets the position to, or the sort of permission to rule through birth, so not necessarily through merit, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, Aquarius, which is more about sort of egalitarianism, the brotherhood of man, and of altruism, sort of so the kind of humanitarian sort of movement, which many see Bitcoin as kind of enabling, if you like. And these are themes which are enshrined also in events like the French Revolution and then in the American Constitution, which I cover in some of my articles again on the Astro Insights blog, particularly in relation to the November 2020 election and the inauguration of Joe Biden. So if you're interested in those themes, I cover them quite extensively in those articles, which you can find on the Astro Insights blog. But if we fast forward to 2020, so this is when Bitcoin had its Jupiter return, which is considered to be a very auspicious time, and it coincides with, you know, age 12, which is in many traditions when men in particular, when boys become men. So if you think about, for example, in the Jewish tradition, you know, you have this idea of the bar mitzvah. And so this coincided with the first major kind of euphoric rise in price for Bitcoin, and we had like a new all-time highs, and also widespread mainstream adoption by Bitcoin by institutions and organizations like Square and I think Visa and a couple of others. So this is the first time ever that we had kind of institutional adoption, or kind of and much more widespread or mainstream adoption, you know, moving into what we later saw as countries adopting Bitcoin as a currency, you know, later on in 2021. But this began at around about the Jupiter return, which coincided with, as I said, that grand conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius, and also the winter solstice of 2020, so the 21st of December 2020, which is, of course, as I say, if you think the summer solstice or the June solstice, particularly in the northern hemisphere, marks the peak of light and then the point of decline, and the opposite is true of the December, the winter solstice. It's the point where the sun reaches its lowest declination, it's the darkest in the northern hemisphere, and the sun starts to then climb. That's why it's associated with the ingress of the sun into the sign of Capricorn, which is the mountain goat, the goat which climbs up the mountain. So, this is the aspirant sort of entrepreneur, or someone who wants to succeed. It's the goat, the sort of the greatest of all time, the person who starts from the bottom and works their way up to the top gradually through sheer grit and determination and hard work. So this is I think associated. We need to see this kind of solstice as being another tipping point, if you like, when we move from kind of darkness and back into light. So this certainly was true of December 2020, when we began a new 20-year cycle, and we had this this beautiful kind of catalyst which took Bitcoin to sort of new all-time highs. And then what's so fascinating is that in May, so a few months later, so almost one eclipse cycle, because we had the start of a new eclipse cycle in December of 2020. So in May, Bitcoin crashed, and interestingly, this coincided within a day of Jupiter changing signs. It moved from Aquarius into Pisces. It retrograded. And what I find so fascinating is, if you kind of go back and you look at some of the previous instances of big market crashes, very often it is when Jupiter moves into the sign of Pisces that we have these huge market crashes. So there may be something, kind of in this that we need to sort of bear in mind as astrologers, that somehow the sign of Pisces for Jupiter is not kind of favorable. It is for Venus. Venus is exalted in Pisces, but not for Jupiter. So yes, and this was also the time of the major eclipses, when Jupiter was in a mutable T-squared with the luminaries. So it was, again, like it is at this particular eclipse, it's going to be making a T-square to the sun and the moon, the luminaries, this time in a fixed T-square. So that is just something to bear in mind, that it's the same as it was in terms of aspect as the lunar eclipse in Sagittarius on the 26th of May. So an eclipse that was ruled by Jupiter, in which Jupiter was in a T-square to the luminaries, and we also had Jupiter moving into the mutable sign of Pisces. So a lot of things where Jupiter is kind of weakened, if you like. Now, as we kind of as we moved into the second half of the year, what was so fascinating is that Jupiter then re-entered Aquarius on around about the 28th or 29th of July. And of course, that was a week after the B-Word conference, when Bitcoin started to move up again. It started to recover in terms of price. It flipped bullish again after its mid-cycle slump. Fast forward now to eclipse season 2.0, which this particular eclipse sets in motion. And we are, of course, approaching Sagittarius season, which is when the sun ingresses into Sagittarius, and that happens on the 22nd of November this year. So in other words, within 3 days of this eclipse. So we really just need to kind of bear that in mind, that we are kind of moving into the sign that is ruled by Jupiter. So a very buoyant, ebullient, enthusiastic sign. It aims its arrows kind of high into the sky, and it's very much a sign of excess. So I think this is kind of telling us astrologically that we're moving back into the kind of the euphoric phase of the bull market again, in terms of Bitcoin. Now, as I said, Jupiter will once again be in a T-square to the luminaries at this eclipse, this time in fixed signs. So in some ways I'm kind of wondering whether this means that we're sort of closing out the bearish cycle that began back in May 2021 with that first mutable T-square, when Jupiter was in that in the sign of Pisces, which doesn't seem to work very well for most markets. This time it's in the sign of Aquarius, and So I just wonder whether it's you know, if we think about the symbolism of a lunar eclipse, we're just closing out that cycle that we had back then. And then moving into December, as I said, Jupiter is approaching its conjunction to the Bitcoin Venus, which is very, very bullish. But it first has to change signs, and this is, I think, where we have to be a little bit careful. So it will enter Pisces just before that. And as I said, there is a long history of market crashes very close to when Jupiter enters or ingresses into Pisces. If we look at 1927, 1928, these are the periods when Jupiter was previously in Pisces, that correlates to major market crashes. So 1927, 1928, and of course we had that huge crash in 1929, 1930, 1974, 1975 when we had stagflation, 1986, 1987, which was just before we had the kind of the yuppie kind of crash, and then again in 1998, 1999, which preceded the 2001 tech bubble and then crash. So it's really worth kind of bearing in mind kind of Jupiter cycles, as I say, because they do coincide quite strongly with the 20-year cycles in the finance markets, with you know, its connection or its movements in relation to Saturn, and of course Saturn is also coming up to a square to Uranus, so another hard aspect. And Uranus is very important in the Bitcoin chart. So a lot of indications that we perhaps need to be a little bit careful as we move into late December, that it's possible that we might have something unexpected, some sort of anomaly, some kind of black swan event, you know, which might interrupt or delay the top of Bitcoin, the Bitcoin bull market. And as I said, secondly, Venus is going to retrograde on the 19th of December. Venus being the wealth maker, I think this is going to be very important because it is approaching the Bitcoin sun. So that's going to be from the 19th of December to the 28th of January 2022. So it's going to stop Venus short of, first of all, making contact to the Bitcoin Jupiter, but also the Bitcoin sun. So I think delaying possibly the top until 2022. So we could have a new all-time high followed by a correction. And I think that, you know, possibly could delay the top until 2022, which is, we'll have a look. There's two kind of theses around this. So let's kind of look at those two scenarios next. So the first one, you know, has to do with this idea of a blow-off top in in December, sort of late December 2021, and this is kind of the thesis of people like, as I say, Jordan Lindsay and Conquering the Markets. So his arguments are for a December peak, and you can go watch his videos. He does some really lovely videos on macro, which he puts up on Conquering the Markets on his YouTube channel, so you can check that out. And you also check him out on Twitter. So he thinks that the peak of the current cycle will start around about the 4th to the 6th of December, which coincides, as I said, with that new moon in I think it's Sagittarius, when we have the new moon in Sagittarius, which is also when we have the new moon solar eclipse happening, because they always happen at a sort of new moon. So when we have that solar eclipse in Sagittarius on the 4th of December, he thinks that that's when we're going to see the start of the third wave into the blow-off top, and he sees the peak being in around about the December solstice, which is around about the 19th to the 20th of so the full moon happens on the 19th of December, the full moon in Gemini, and the ingress of the sun into Capricorn, which is the December solstice, happens on let's see, when does the sun move into the 21st, so the 21st of December. So at that full moon, or sort of just after, at the solstice, is when he sees the blow-off top kind of being, and then thinks that possibly there will be like a taper tantrum or something of that nature, which will lead to a bit of a crash and the decline into the bear market, which of course fits with the idea of the Saturn-Uranus square, which, you know, if we look at previous cycles, coincided, for example, with the Nasdaq crash in mid-February of 2021, and then Bitcoin's crash in May, June 2021, when we had the second pass of that particular transit. And then the alternative is the Ken Stanfield model, where this is the Australian Ken Stanfield, who argues that cycles in Bitcoin are getting 43% longer. So this may be due to decreasing volatility, which, as I said before, the radical root has pointed to, is that with every 4-year cycle we've seen a decline in volatility. And this could possibly mean that instead of huge kind of peaks up and down, that those peaks almost get sort of stretched out, if you like, and they become longer. So in his model, he's predicting that the peak of the current cycle will only come next year in around about spring 2022. So his date for the top is the 25th of May 2022. But that it will start in mid-October, with the 3 waves, which is what we did see when we had those new moons that were also very turbocharged with Mars and Mercury, kind of hitting pedal to the metal, basically. So yes, you can see here that he sees the peak as being around about, kind of late May of 2022, which is when the sun is in the sign of Taurus. So interesting links to, as I say, the fact that we've got this Taurus lunar eclipse happening at the moment. So those are the 2 theses. And, at the moment, I think things are, the jury's kind of out as to which way things are going to go. I am going to look at this in more detail when I come to the my forecast for the upcoming solar eclipse, the December solar eclipse. I'll look at these in more detail and kind of narrow down what I feel the astrology is potentially saying. But I think these are what we need to kind of bear in mind going into late December, early January. So just being aware of the next 3 months and treading very carefully that there are these 2 scenarios, and we need to be prepared for anything, particularly given that we have Uranus so strong as a signature at this lunar eclipse, and that's all about expecting the unexpected, being prepared for anything. So yes, I think that's all I really want to kind of say. I think this has been quite a long forecast and plenty of food for thought. If you are interested in my more traditional eclipse forecasts, I am doing them for members, so those members who subscribe to my website. You can find out details about my tiers of subscriptions on in sort of the Astrosphere shop. So if you are interested in getting access to those 6-month eclipse horoscopes, which I will be posting in the next couple of weeks for paying members of my website, then go to astrologysphere.com/subscribe, and you can sign up there for the I think it's the gold subscription, where you can get access to those eclipse horoscopes, in addition to some of the other things that I do for the kind of basic tier membership. So something to think about, but yes, be interested to see what happens over the next couple of weeks. It's definitely going to be an interesting one. I think going to be quite an exciting time. So yes, let's kind of buckle up our seatbelts and get ready for the ride. Yeah, and as I say, I'll see you again in a couple of weeks for my final forecast for 2021, which is going to be that December solar eclipse forecast at the new moon. But till then, all the best, have a great fortnight, and happy trading.